early 1900s marked an era of turmoil and corruption. In the midst of this political and economic chaos of Prohibition, one man would take the throne as the most renowned gangster of his time, Al Capone. Son of an Italian immigrant family, Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn.
Al Capone and his family were really an unlikely choice for the gangster world because Al Capone's mother was actually a seamstress and his father was a hairdresser or a barber, and they were devout Roman Catholics and they didn't really have any basis for all their children to become gangsters.
Despite a humble upbringing, Al dropped out of school at age 11 for hitting a school teacher and eventually worked at a bar owned by a mobster. He got his first taste of the mob life when a hoodlum named Frank DeLucio slashed Capone across the left cheek, giving Capone the name Scarface. Capone's gang life officially started when he was recruited by Johnny Terrio, a Brooklyn mobster. Soon after, Capone married May Coughlin and had a child, and together they moved to Chicago to join the chaos created by the Prohibition. At this time, Terrio worked as the second-hand man to Jim Colosino, the boss of the biggest underground prostitution and bootlegging business in Chicago. Believing that the time was right, Terrio ordered Capone to kill Colosino. He became Capone's first victim. After taking over Colosimo's organization, Capone went to work establishing bars and clubs that he now owned. He soon became widely known in Chicago and in the suburbs of Cicero. To get a club or a bar to buy his bootlegged beer, Capone would first use bribery or blackmail. If they would refuse, he would then bomb the place, then offer to pay to have it fixed. Once the repairs were done, they were now part of Capone's underground network. With this corrupted business scheme, Capone became renowned with his flamboyance and charm as a businessman, but a ruthless terror as a gangster.
One instance when Al Capone showed his dynamic character was when a Cicero news reporter by the name of Robert St. John didn't really like what Al Capone was doing. And so he decided to start writing about him in his local newspaper, and Al Capone really disliked this, and as St. John was going one day through the crosswalk, Al Capone and a few of his men went and beat him up with bats and other various objects. And interestingly enough, when St. John woke up in the hospital, he found that Al Capone had already paid for his medical bill.
Lucky to be alive, men like Robert St. John were a warning to any who dared speak out against Capone. At the peak of his reign, Capone was making over $120 million each year, about the same amount that a large corporation made. But he started running into other gangsters, jealous of the power that Capone had. One Northside mob leader, Dion O'Banion, tried to swindle Capone in a booze trade. Capone, of course, had O'Banion killed, starting a war between him and the Northside gang. 1925 to 1929 marked the most violent era in Chicago gang wars, as Northside gang member Bugs Moran tried to get revenge on Capone. Shots were fired back and forth within these years, killing many, including a Chicago statesman, creating an outrage among the public. The new dangers prompted Capone to bulletproof his car and secure a hideout at the Lexington Hotel. But Bugs Moran from the Northside gang was still on the loose, so Capone went to Florida to plan his most infamous crime yet.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was one of the most interesting acts of gang warfare in the 1920s. Al Capone was visiting the district attorney of Miami. Moran was visiting one of his warehouses in Chicago. 4 of Al Capone's men, 2 of them dressed as police officers and 2 of them wearing regular civilian clothes, entered. Well, Moran thought that it was a raid on his bootlegging, so he and his men turned against the wall and put his hands up. Al Capone's men took out rifles and started mowing them down.
On February 14, 1929, Moran and 6 others were eliminated from Capone's hit list. With Capone's name already tainted with so many killings, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre only led to complete public opposition to the gangster, labeling him as public enemy number 1. But Capone wanted to be the good guy, not the villain, and so he opened up a soup kitchen in Chicago. However, the federal government and the IRS were determined to put an end to Capone's reign. But it was much more difficult than expected, for Capone literally did not own a thing.
Eventually, the federal government became weary of Al Capone's criminal activity. They were determined to get him behind bars. Beginning with his tax records, they searched for past instances where he evaded taxes. Eventually, they found out that he had evaded $250,000 in tax revenue. The IRS, who was working for the government, decided to indict him for these charges, and they eventually sentenced him for 11 years in prison.
Capone was indicted on June 5, 1931 for 22 counts of income tax evasion. He of course tried all of his dirty tricks, like bribing the jury and paying off the court, but George E.Q. Johnson, the United States Attorney and Capone's prosecutor, made sure that Capone didn't get his way. With no more tricks up his sleeve, Al Capone was found guilty. Sentenced to 11 years in prison, he spent 3 of them in Atlanta, then was transferred to Alcatraz in 1934. There, in 1938, Al was officially diagnosed with syphilis. In 1940, he was released due to illness and lived in his Florida getaway until he died of a heart attack on January 25, 1947. He was 48 years old. Although Capone himself died, his influence was widely felt all across the country as the stepping stone to American mob life. Today, his legacy lives on through history books and films. Al Capone will always be remembered by the odd mix as both a Robin Hood figure and as the greatest American gangster that ever lived.